Okay, so welcome again to Cyber Science 2020, continuing on our track one, which is critical national infrastructures and CERTs. So the third presentation on this track today is by Andrew Ray and Asma Patel. So they will be presenting their work on developing a security behavioral assessment approach for cyber rating UR in MSBs. So welcome Andrew to present.
Thank you, Cyril, and welcome to the conference. And also I want to give our appreciation being able to present our paper today. As Cyril introduced, my name is Andrew Ray from Lancaster University, and my co-author is Dr. Asma Patel from Staffordshire University. So the next stage really is to understand what we'll be talking about today. So we've broken it down into 5 key areas. First is to give you a background as to why we started this research question and some stats behind it, as well as under the guise of the time we have, we'll talk about a couple of solutions that we've highlighted from our research, and then we engage with 20 MSBs and we'll give you some insight from the findings we had. And then to conclude, we'll give you some findings from our research and then identify some future developments that we'll be working on next. So let's look at in terms of the background to this project. So why did we focus on UK MSBs or micro small businesses that are engaged in a variety of supply chain as well as C&I stuff? It's fundamentally is they are the vast amount of all UK businesses, 99.3% or 5.8 million of them exist. And what's interestingly is majority of those MSBs are run by typically 1 or 2 individuals. What that means is we have the potential there to have significant impact on their behaviors, specifically around information security. Now that's important when we're looking at critical supply chains, certainly in the C&I world, where the UK government has set a target where 1/3 of all their contracts are to be delivered by small to medium enterprises by 2022. Now that slipped from 2020, but within small to medium enterprises, the vast majority, over 96%, are MSBs. Now, in the context of today's world, you can see it in terms of reported cyber incidents. It's actually risen significantly from 33% in 2018 to 47% in 2019. And that is providing a significant rise in cost that the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support did for their annual cybersecurity breaches survey last year. And that found that the cost per disruptive breach for an MSB has risen significantly from £894 to £3,650, which for a small business, as you can appreciate, is serious amount of money. In terms of actually looking at more granular in terms of the information, we found that from the ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office, that 90% of all reported data breaches were caused by human errors. And that reinforced that behaviors and awareness and that perception gap is very important for us to understand, because it's not usually and this was interesting from the survey, that things like antivirus software, which you may think would alert it, it's actually the majority of those alerts have come from staff. And therefore, having that human interaction is vitally important. In terms of the perceptional side, from an MSB, it's risen again in terms of not feeling susceptible to being attacked because of their size. That's risen from 24% to 35% in 2019. And this perceived lack of susceptibility kind of feels like it's a logical connection as to some of the reasons that MSBs give for not prioritizing cybersecurity and also not seeing cybersecurity as a high risk. And that's kind of reflected in the fact that only 32% of MSBs have security policies compared to 71% medium-sized businesses. In a C&I context, obviously that is significant and needs to be reviewed. And that kind of forms what we class as a cybersecurity apathy, which has become ingrained in many MSBs. And that's reflected by a certain stat where only 26% of them have sent their staff on cybersecurity training. And as we know, training is vital when we're looking at how we're going to combat awareness. The interesting reverse of that survey was that 77% of MSBs actually thought they had the necessary level of cybersecurity skills. Again, reinforce that perceptual gap between reality and their thoughts. Excuse me. So we'll move on to just looking at some solutions. And one of the things you'll see in our paper is we produce something called a personal cyber engagement plan. And what we're here is looking at how do we evaluate and provide key indicators to enable behavioral change around information security. Certainly within the supply chain and throughout small businesses, this is something that is limited in both research, but in something that could have fundamental effects when you're looking at things like gaining a third of your procurement for a UK government being small businesses. So we'll take the first area, which is around the actual process. We've simplified this just to quickly show on screen, but really it goes across 3 phases, and that's around assessing, scoring, and evaluating. What we found from previous research, such as Patel University, was that security-related decision-making is way more complex and nuanced. It's not a case of a sort of a simple carrot and a stick. And also decisions are not necessarily grounded in rational reasoning. What that kind of research showed is risk decisions can be situational, such as things like peer pressure. And really a lot of that is not being taken into account in current security decision models. And for smaller businesses, we need to make sure they have clear, short-term and immediately measurable benefits. So pretty much everything needs to be justified when you're engaging with money and resources. So as part of that assessment, and we'll go into the 4 segments in more detail, that enables us to identify a behavioral change route map, which we can then validate against test exercises. One of the things we promoted within our research is looking at inferential and influential factors. So from both a promotion and a prevention technique. We need to understand that so it can impact on things like normative belief, self-efficacy, and that's vital when businesses, for instance, and MSBs are run by 1 or 2 people. And another area we want to focus on is we need to understand how ready an MSB is. Certainly when, again, you're talking about the criticality of C&Is, we need to make sure that we can align those behaviors to best practice. And we've created or refined an industry model to enable us to do that. The scoring is based on a 1 to 5 scale, which enables us to give understanding around perceptions, prior experiences, risk propensity, that self-efficacy I mentioned, controllability, and also external reinforcements. We can learn them from both a technical-based questionnaire, which is typically how security standards are run, like Cyber Essentials, also to incorporate behavioral analysis and how that interface with each other. What we want to move away from is just judging on self-reporting. We actually want evidence behind this in terms of the attitudes, and then the evidence that those will have an impact and how they align with the current threat landscape. And that's why each of these scoring is based on a personalized weighted score. That enables us to better map those behavioral influences and also helps us, as you'll see in the evaluation, better prioritize those engagements. We can then validate that way to enable that we can find the best and most optimal route to elicit secure behaviors. We move on to the next section, which is around the evaluation scoring. And this is probably where I'll just cover quickly some of the key points due to the time. Is the main ethos that we have is the fact is we believe through our research that security awareness as conceived is not working as it should do. So we've looked at theories around protection motivation theory, theory of planned behavior, general deterrence theory, the technology acceptance model. And we found across these 5 highly recognized models, there are roughly around about 11 factors which you could apply to develop secure behaviors within an information security context. You'll notice a few on here that we sort of stripped down, But some of the key factors that we can highlight that would affect certain results are things like attitude, perceived usefulness, and to some weaker extent, self-efficacy, perception of severity of threats, etc. Within our paper as well, you can understand things around the big 5 personality traits, things like people who are highly extroverted are more likely to violate security policies, say, than those that are conscientious or open. So one of the challenges we've got to do, and part of this scoring, is how do we avoid those positive skews where people are generally unwilling to admit committing unethical or insecure behaviors. And that's why we've broken it down into these 4 segments. That enables us then to develop against each of them a weighted view around how and to what extent these areas are influencing and influential factors per MSB. And that enables us then to plot out a way to evaluate their behaviors and what gives us the best opportunity to intervene and make those positive reinforcements. The other area that we looked at this was around the cyber readiness side. And one of the key points of this was to establish really how ready is a organization. And the way we've worked it is to build it from a behavioral perspective and how closely that maps up to best practice, such as by the National Cybersecurity Centre. So we asked respondents a series of questions. In this case, it was 20, around covering 4 key areas. So within a strategic element, the leadership and resourcing. And on the other side, the implementation was based on technology and process. And what you'll see there is the vast majority of businesses are unready, i.e. they're novices. And in fact, our 75%, interestingly, matches similar to the UK stat, which is around 72% nationally. We've also found that to score a cyber ready or prepared statement, as in an expert, you have to score on both axes. Now that's purposely developed because in essence, we want to make sure that people are ready at a minimum baseline of which this is what this is set. So the outcome from our report is that the majority of the ones who were deemed as vulnerable or intermediates were better at technology and process than they were on their leadership behaviors and resourcing. And that's an area that we need to investigate further in terms of how do we increase that to then move them into the next stage of being prepared. So in terms of some of our findings, and just because of time, I won't spend too long on this, you'll see that as I'll go through this list, we did a survey over 2 stages. So again, 20 MSB participants, pre-introduction, and then a month later, we did a presentation on the PCEP theory and gave some control questions to see if that had any impact or change. So some of the key areas I will identify is that we managed to have a small change in perceiving themselves too small to be attacked. And that was using evidence and information that was relatable to them. Now, we don't know, of course, whether that has any retention value at this stage, but that's something we can certainly look at. It also said that we raised the realization of how unprepared they actually were to an attack, which again is helpful in terms of understanding and closing that gap between perception and reality. The final thing I would just mention on this one is we also gave them the appetite to see if there was demonstrable benefits, how they would then engage further into things like Cyber Essentials or other such approved cybersecurity standards. Now that is really important when you consider that, you know, 0.1% of a percent actually go for things like Cyber Essentials in this country, and that's something that definitely needs to be delivered on. And that comes from producing a value proposition that is relevant and pertinent to them, and also has an ability to create immediate value and effect. And that moves away from the traditional method that we've used around more general deterrence of saying, if you don't do this, then certain things will be able to affect. And we've known from certain campaigns around smoking and things of that nature that is a long process if you just use deterrence as the factor to initiate behavioral change. So as we're coming to the close, I'll just push on in terms of the primary engagement channel. so excuse as I go through this. But what this really was about was creating an ability to have external reinforcements. And what we found in our research was that that external reinforcements enables, whether it's through encouragement, mandatory requirements, or threats of sanctions, really has an ability to impact and really have great effect onto person security behaviors. Now, we put there in terms of what the kind of criteria it needed to be. And for us, what we found is actually banks and insurance companies provided a great opportunity to reinforce, as pretty much all MSBs have access to all of these areas. And certainly every MSB that we talked to had either a bank account or they had insurance. And certainly within the UK, it's regulatory requirements when you have employees to have insurance. And from our survey, 60% would consider that as a referral process. So in terms of actually the kind of conclusions we come to, one of the things we believe, to elicit changes, you need both inferential and influencing factors. That will help you change things like intention and also allow things like promote and prevention to be focused on. We believe things like trust and confidence is a big factor to try and develop that nudge-based approach. Sweeping changes in behaviours are usually very difficult to do, but if we can start building in that process of actually changing through iteration, and that is certainly something we can do, and that will help change things like self-efficacy and controllability, which again are key factors when you look at behavioural change. We need to start producing a lot more breach examples that are relevant for them and pertinent to them, so actually become something that they can see. They obviously get to see everything in the news, but that's typically big companies or very high profile attempts. It also adds to the fact that they don't think they will be attacked because they're too small. We need to avoid overstressing prevention security, because that could actually have the opposite effect. And there's a bit of research around how deterrence, if it's too severe, can actually have a counter impact. And interestingly, in terms of government sources, which is currently being pushed through now, there's actually a lack of single trusted source of information. And we present that it should actually be non-government supported. And primary engagement potential is from the finance insurance. That will enable almost to kickstart that behavioural engagement program that we've talked about. And the conclusion we come to is MSBs as it stands are certainly not cyber ready. So the final point really is just to give you a couple of statements around where we're going next. And that's around, we're going to increase our sampling base to really start getting into some more detailed analysis. We're going to spend more time on self-efficacy and controllability, and to see how that has a wider evaluation within our PCEP concept. And we're going to look at how we can develop mechanisms for behavioural change after we've done this stage, because in essence, all we're doing here is evaluating those behaviourals and what are those influences. Of course, what we've not identified is what do we need to then implement to initiate or elicit change. And then finally, we're going to look at piloting with a primary engagement channel, just to see how realistic and effective that is. And that's something we're really excited about developing. So I hope it wasn't too rushed and gives you a good overview of our project. And we want to thank you for listening and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very, very thorough, and I enjoyed it. You've got loads of questions, so complimentary, because I think people enjoyed it.
Good.
In no particular order. So one of the questions here is, who were your respondents in the survey for SMEs? And could you describe more of the samples?
Yeah, sure, of course. So on this particular one, it's a fairly small sample. So it was 20. We had 15 micro businesses, so that's 0 to 9 employees. And we had 5 small, so that's 10 to 49 employees. We did it across 9 industry sectors, just to give us a sort of an initial taste around, does it vary between manufacturing to retail, etc. And as part of that future development now within the 100, we want to expand the numbers then to actually see, can we then correlate information, and do certain sectors share certain traits or behavioral traits that we can then use. And then certainly when we look at things like CNI and supply chain, things like defense, nuclear, etc., energy, we can then spend a lot more time, and that's part of this 100, is to understand then, is there areas that we need to involve when it involves heavier levels of regulation and stringent security controls, and does that in effect produce behavioral change, or actually are we living in a false reality in terms of are we overconfident just because we have the tick box exercises that people tend to do? So yeah, I hope that gives you sort of a thorough understanding of the kind of people we engaged.
Thank you, Andrew. Another question is, mindful that the survey and the research is UK focused, so it's UK MSBs, and you are writing using a standard by the UK government, the National Cyber Security Centre. But also, did you also consider things like the NIST cybersecurity standard in the wider analysis?
Yeah, I think that's it was certainly one of the things we looked at. And actually, some of the previous works before this paper, we identified, we worked more around ISO 27001, which was an international standard, and obviously NIST, which is the US-based one. We could certainly apply it. I mean, the ethos and the criteria we build in terms of the behavior and stuff, although we're aligning things like cyber readiness to cyber processes for the UK, there is nothing to stop us mapping that across any other standard or country. The process would be similar. And in fact, it'd be really interesting to see within Europe, US, Asia, etc., whether does that behavior mapping then change in terms of when you add things like societal areas or cultures. And that, again, is another big factor that we will need to look at. And certainly this is just the start of that work.
Thanks, Andrew. There are many questions going in, and I'm going to try and entertain them as much as possible because there is an hour break before the keynote. So I hope you don't mind. This is quite interesting. So one of the questions that have come in says, to what extent do you think SMEs leadership could be more responsible to increasing their security to protect other parties in the industry?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting one because the statistics show that I think the last threat attack, there was around about 60% of people suffered cybersecurity attacks within their supply chain. And the issue with leadership, or certainly for smaller companies, comes down to individual attitudes. So what we found is a lot of them perceive standards, things like what we've talked about there with Cyber Essentials or ISO, as being too costly, too complex to implement and manage. It lacks relevance. The totality of effort needed outweighs the perceived benefits. And really what they're looking for is more practical, pertinent and tangible areas. So within a supply chain, which you can incorporate from a small company right up to the top, that's certainly an area that we want to see how we can mature and grow that behavior, because I think within supply chain, we could have the greatest impact in because I know from a fact, speaking to large enterprises, one of their major concerns is getting smaller companies involved and connected to their networks. That's seen as a big risk for them. And in fact, even though our UK government wants to purport getting more SMEs involved in those supply chains, from a CNI point of view, it's very difficult to have. And in fact, unless it's a manual type contract, etc., when it's involving technology systems, it still tends to be the larger companies that are trading between the larger companies. So we think there's an opportunity where SMEs have a great deal to give within the supply chain, but we also understand from a maturity and a governance point of view, we've got a significant gap between the two sides of companies. So that's hopefully one of the big areas of this research will be how we can affect significant change and actually promote SMEs to get in it. And again, that adds incentivization to SMEs to do this because it means they get access to other opportunities, supply chain contracts, etc.
Thanks, Andrew. Two more, we go. So the other bit says, thanks for using the survey and questionnaire as research methods. So did you then carry out technical verification tests in terms of testing that the responses you received we're in burgers in a way, but we are actually correct and rightful. So what are the research methods that you employed in this research?
Yeah, so we certainly we went on the basis of confidence levels as well. So in terms of the research, obviously the sample size is very small, and you know, we highlighted that obviously there is issues where potentially there could be sample bias to this. But from what we could do in terms of how we can verify this, we ran several control elements with these. So part of the getting the 20 MSBs, there was actually a process before that, which was actually engaging around about 35 to 36 SMMBs, and we factored them down based on what we felt was of a higher confidence level in the kind of information we're given. And we also requested certain levels of evidence in terms of from some of the questions we asked. So for instance, when we asked them about policies, we asked them to supply us a quick show or show them on there. Obviously, we're mindful on data protection, etc. But we explained to them what we're trying to do and gave them the full visibility of this. So in terms of what we could do as the kind of the standardized effect size, we believe we did a robust test. Obviously, the sample size is limiting on that, and that's why we really want to go into a larger pool, and then we could add greater levels of confidence in the kind of findings we've got.
Thank you. And the final one, Andrew, and thanks for going on. So this is about your model where you had external persons, and there you use social network, a reference to social network. Could you expatiate on your social networks, what in terms of the context of your research, what that meant?
Sorry, just explain that question again about social research, did you say?
Social networks. So in your quadrant, you had four of those.
Okay.
One was the external person, and inside that quadrant, you had social networks.
Okay.
Yes, expatiate on what that meant in regards to the context of the research.
Yeah, sure, of course. So on the external personal side, we looked at more what kind of influences have from decision-making processes within the respondent's peer network. So when we say social network, we mean people like friends, family, and such like, ones that they would have levels of trust to and would listen to certain advices. And also that could be other colleagues at work and past experiences, rather than say social networks on social media, Twitter, etc. So these were more known people that would have a level of trust and experience from, so that would have a greater influence on. Now, of course, you could expand this to incorporate, you know, certain other levels like social media, etc. But for the level to get us to a baseline, we focused on purely ones that have a trust threshold.